Out of Zimbabwe, the MDC alliance says its leader Nelson Chamisa cannot take responsibility for what happened yesterday where the protest turned violent. Chamisa's spokesperson, Dr Nkululeko Sibanda, spoke exclusively to the SABC at the Results Center.
MDC supporters were coming into town to celebrate. We are told, we hear that, and we as you see, they're not necessarily card-carrying members, they're supporters, I think, and there's no guarantee that all those who committed acts of violence, if there were any, were our supporters. The important thing is that they should exercise their right in a peaceful and lawful manner.
Are you taking responsibility as politicians in this part of the world for not really giving a proper leadership?
The president hasn't called for any damage. In fact, the president is saying they should be peaceful engagement.
For analysis on this, we now joined from a series in Pretoria by political analyst Dr Showers Mawowa. Dr Mawowa, good afternoon to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us here on SABC News. Let's just get your first reaction to the ZANU-PF media briefing where they were basically condemning the violence that erupted yesterday.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to you and your viewers. I missed a great part of the ZANU-PF presser, but from what I can gather is that they've made a rather general statement which condemns violence, which I think is welcome as a first step. But I think there is a fundamental issue here that needs to be drawn, which is about the deployment of the military and the opening of fire against unarmed civilians. Yep. I think it's not something that we want to accept, that whenever anyone calls people to protest, that protest should necessarily lead to the deployment of the army and the firing of civilians, most of whom it appears, according to the image we've seen, were actually running away. So they were not necessarily posing a threat to the army or anyone. We have also seen protests in Harare before. This is not the first one, where the police has actually managed to contain those protests. So it's quite disturbing why, in this particular case, the first resort was to call in the army.
All right, but from where you're sitting, Dr. Mawowa, who should take the blame for what happened yesterday? Because it looks like none of the two parties want to take the blame. We've just had the ZANU-PF, of course, their media briefing where they were basically saying they do not want to take the blame, of course, shifting the blame onto MDC, and the MDC, on the other hand, saying their leader, Nelson Chamisa, cannot be blamed for the situation.
Well, I think as far as the deterioration and the loss of lives, which is quite disturbing for me, the blame should be placed squarely on the military. And part of the investigation should not be only about who fired the shots, but who called in the army. What was the motivation? Because from what I can gather, and given the past history, that the police has actually been able to contain even bigger protests than this. Why was it necessary to call the army in the first place?
And of course, we've been reporting since this morning that Tendai BT was expected to hand himself over to the police, as the police wanted to question him, of course, over what happened yesterday. What do you make of that? I mean, we do know that he is one of the leaders who actually came out before the election saying that Zimbabwe will be ungovernable should the MDC alliance not win the elections.
Yeah, of course, we have heard from his lawyer that he's going to present himself to the police. I can imagine that the police and the authorities would want to tread very carefully given the tensions that are existing at the moment. I think what Zimbabwe needs more than anything is dialogue across the political divide. But it's also important to point out that as far as the violence that occurred yesterday, it involved one political party, but not necessarily against supporters of another political party. because we haven't seen ZANU-PF supporters in this equation. So it has been very much the state against supporters of a particular political party. But having said that, I think we have already seen the messages from President Emmerson Mnangagwa towing, I think, a more conciliatory approach this morning compared to his statement yesterday, that he is engaging with Nelson Chamisa. And I think this is the way to go. There is need for dialogue. There is need for caution.
All right. And how do you think President Emmerson Mnangagwa, do you really think he's sort of desperate to win the international trust and approval as well in order for him to be able to tap into the International Monetary Fund? I mean, we do know that Zimbabwe is currently facing financial problems.
That's an important question, because after all has been said and done, we need to ask ourselves, what was the purpose of this election? What was it meant to deliver? And if you then go back in history and locate this election in the context of a 2-decade political and economic crisis, which was characterized by a number of things, among them an economic crisis which saw Zimbabwe recording the second highest ever hyperinflation in world history, an economy which declined 40% of its GDP over a period of 10 years, the only country to have experienced such rapid decline outside a war situation. It was also an election which one would have expected to deliver on the question of legitimacy. Zimbabwe has had contested elections for so many years, which has resulted, among other things, in international isolation. And this election was really meant to deliver and restore legitimacy, re-establish international engagement. But I think with the way things are turning out, I think the reaction yesterday is a reminder that perhaps Zimbabwe is not so much of a new dispensation that we have expected it to be.
All right, so are you basically saying there is no light at the end of the tunnel for Zimbabwe going forward?
Well, I think much depends on what's going to happen now. So the election could have been a benchmark which would have provided a fresh start. But I think if you look at even the reports, the preliminary assessments by the various observer missions, they have fallen short of declaring the election free, fair, and credible. They have acknowledged that it's an improvement. The EU, for example, was quite clear that it has fallen short of the mark on a number of aspects. So I think the election in itself as a process has not done enough to restore Zimbabwe to political normalcy and to be accepted that it's really a country that can now re-engage and the question of legitimacy has been solved. But having said that, I think the fact that there's been an election could, depending on how political leaders manage this process going forward, I think there is enough international goodwill. In fact, the international community seemed to have been desperate to have an election which will provide the slightest justification for full re-engagement. So I think that international will is there, that keenness to engage is there, and much will depend on how they manage this conflicted process that is unfolding going forward.
We've just had a conversation with SABC senior anchor Peter Ndoro, who's basically saying Zimbabwe has been relatively quiet from this morning to this point. And we've also had the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission basically saying that they may announce the final presidential elections, of course, results rather, at around 5 p.m. What do you think will happen going forward post the announcement of the final results?
So, I mean, if assuming that Mnangagwa wins the election, he has the state machinery to enforce order, you know. So you may have a situation of negative peace where violence is absent, but that does not necessarily mean people are free to express themselves. That may augur well for investors who are just looking for stability, but will create challenges for the long-term stability of the country. But there's also a question that Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF would have to deal with, which is about social cohesion and the nature of the social contract that they have with the people of Zimbabwe. You have a situation where the ruling party is actually deriving its mandate largely from the rural electorate, but the mandate is lacking when it comes to the urban electorate. And I think that does not augur well for social cohesion. The people in the urban areas have a different relationship with government because they have a fiscal contract. These are the people who pay taxes. These are the people who are affected by things like unemployment, cash shortages, compared to those who are in the rural areas. So the new, if Mnangagwa gets a new mandate, we would really have to invest in re-establishing vertical cohesion and investing in the social contract with the urban electorate, because what is clear from this election is that Zimbabwe is a deeply divided society in terms of its political preferences.
Yeah.
I think if Chamisa is going to come out as a winner in this election, he has a tall order. How do you run a government when you have less than a third of parliamentarians? That is likely to see a very acrimonious situation unfolding where the government might stagnate and be hamstrung in terms of delivering, his mandate, and a lot of things may actually be blocked by the parliament. So it's going to be a very tenuous period going forward.
Now, you talk of social cohesion that needs to be realized and a dialogue that needs to take place between the two parties. Do you really think that will happen? And if it happens, are we likely to see what happened back in 2009 where Zimbabwe had a Zimbabwe government of national unity where the two parties were working together? Is it likely to happen this time around?
So if Chamisa was to win the election, a GNU could be something that political players could be persuaded to do, because he would also realize that the balance of power does not necessarily favor him. So there might be more inclination to form a GNU. But I think if Mnangagwa wins, he, at least on paper, from the election, has a very clear and a strong mandate. He may be less persuaded to form a government of national unity. But what we have seen in terms of the surveys is also that Zimbabweans would actually prefer a government of national unity if you look at the Afrobarometer surveys. And I think what Zimbabweans are really looking for is an inclusive political settlement that is able to deal with the core conflict issues, which are to do with the abuse and centralization of power, and delivering in terms of the economic expectations of the masses. And those things would not, cannot be achieved by one party alone. I think the opposition will also have a role to play in terms of legitimizing the government, ensuring that Zimbabwe moves forward away from this stalemate that Zimbabwe has experienced since 2000 of a political logjam caught up in a virtual crisis of economic deterioration and lack of legitimacy.
All right. And I suppose we'll wait and see what happens, Dr. Mawowa. I mean, like reports coming out of Zimbabwe now are basically saying that it looks like the ZANU-PF has comfortably won the majority of seats in parliament. But of course, we're waiting on that announcement by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission in a few hours.